My first question is, what are your thoughts on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I thought it was a disaster. I felt like we turned our back on our friends, and 13 brave Americans lost their lives unnecessarily. And we broke our promise, and then we left, I guess, billions of dollars, millions of armament on the ground, and now we're arming our enemies.
In those 13 people who died during the withdrawal, there was Army Staff Sergeant Ryan
Knauss.
Yes, well, Ryan Knauss.
That's all right.
Who was one of your constituents.
Yes, sir, and his family are my neighbors. I know his mama and daddy very well, and his stepmama. And you drive out of my house and turn left, and there's a sign right there, and it's Staff Sergeant Ryan Knauss Memorial Highway, and he should not have died. He should not have died. We blundered.
Besides those 30 service members of American military in Afghanistan, more than 100 people died in that day, citizens of Afghanistan. What could have been done to avoid that disaster and this disaster in general?
Of course, we call it in America Monday morning quarterbacking, because the ball game be Sunday night and you tell what you would have done. But I felt like our rules of engagement got those people killed. We had a Marine sniper who had the suicide bomber not once but twice in his sights. He had to get permission from the State Department or military intelligence to take the guy out. And that specifically could have been done. We ought to trust the judgment of our Marines on the ground. My daddy was a Marine. He fought in the Second World War. And it's hard for somebody sitting behind a desk to judge what's going on out in the field. And that too, we should have had a more strategic withdrawal. We should have had things in place to where if the Taliban or whoever violated those rules, then we would have stopped and engaged them, but we didn't. We just seemed like we just threw up our hands and just left.
The disaster of American withdrawal from Afghanistan is not only about that day when 3 American servicemen and women and also more than 100 citizens of Afghanistan were killed.
Absolutely.
It's about, people in Afghanistan view it in a different way, right? My question is how you would, do something different to avoid that disaster.
I believe we should have, if we still had a presence there, it would be a stabilizing factor. We're on the border with South and North Korea. North Korea they rattle the sabers, and they do a little mischief, but not a lot. And same in Europe. We have people in Europe. We've had people in Japan, and that keeps China in check, and there's no bullets fired. And I feel like if us and NATO still had some sort of presence there at some level, that would change the outcome.
Recently, General Petraeus, former CIA chief, also said that United States have to, remain in Afghanistan and keep some level of presence. Do you think the American people would support that kind of idea, that kind of presence?
I think what we've got to do is change the narrative. When we go into a situation like this, it's that we state that in the front end. We will have a presence there. And we did not do that, I felt like. We were there 20 years, but at some point, I felt like, under Trump, it seemed like the hostilities toned down a little. And then when we show a sign of weakness, when we just pulled out as we did, it just encouraged
hostilities turned down against American soldiers.
Yes,
not against the national army and police of Afghanistan.
Right.
And it was Donald Trump who signed the agreement for withdrawal. Do you think it was a good idea to sign that agreement?
Well, he had kept a political promise, which is unusual in this town, but they did not follow his instructions to the T.
Who?
The current administration, the Biden and Harris administration. There was agreements in place that it was incremental. That's the word I was looking for, incremental. So when they got up to a certain point, they would, if there's any nonsense, then that's where they'd stop, or they would engage the enemy. Under the Biden administration, unfortunately, we just pulled out, and it was very disorganized. And it wasn't even the central location that we pulled out from wasn't even the one that Trump had the air base that we went from. And then you saw our ambassador and everybody pull out. I thought prematurely. And
how much longer do you think United States had needed to maintain its presence in Afghanistan?
I don't know.
Because it was always said in the U.S. that it's the longest war in our history.
Longest war in our history, yeah.
Not very popular war.
And I also think about the Americans that lost their lives and my buddies that fought over there, and they feel like it was just all for naught because we did not have a stabilizing presence there. And I felt like we did them a disservice as well.
President Biden, not only once but several times said that democracy was not made for Afghanistan. What do you think? What made President Biden to say that? What makes him to think that?
I think it's probably more tradition than anything else. I mean, that's an easy thing to say. But when they were voting to go over there, they sure as heck didn't say that. And I think that we were very short-sighted in that. I know it was the longest war technically ever, but I think that on the front end, again, we should be telling America and Americans, this is not a short-term deal, and this is our plan, and this is what we're going to do. And we just didn't follow that.
People in Afghanistan ask why American government stands by democracy in Ukraine, but they think that democracy is not made for Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, I think
what is the basis of that judgment?
Crooked politicians. I think it was unpopular. The Afghanistan war started becoming politically unpopular in this town and across America. And then our old-time enemy, Russia, whose GDP is somewhere between France and Canada, was all of a sudden this world threat that they weren't. And the arms dealers made a fortune. And members of Congress, both parties, made a fortune on their investments.
You introduced at least 2 legislations on Afghanistan. The most recent one asked for designating the Taliban as a terrorist group. What made you to think about this and to propose this legislation?
Anger. I have a good friend, Sean Ryan, who's a former Navy SEAL and CIA contractor who has a podcast, and he's over in Nashville. And I've been on his show a couple times. And he had a guy named Scott Mann, who's a former Green Beret and legend. That's the name he goes by. He's an Afghan-American, former non-commissioned officer, alerted me to what was going on over there and what we were doing and what we could be doing. And we formulated this plan because of that.
And the question is why United States never designated Taliban as a terrorist group in the past 20 years during the Republican and Democrat administrations.
Yeah, well.
Why it never happened?
Probably because I wasn't in Congress the last 20 years. I don't care. The Taliban they're bad actors and they need to be called out on it. And when we cherry pick at different areas, that we want to get into, I think we make a big mistake and not go with our partners that we have around the world. And this kind of forces everybody's hand. And also it hits them. It forces us to discuss the issue so that we're not all hitting the same point. we can spread our resources out and not duplicate. And two, that will eliminate a lot of the corruption we see in these things. The Vienna process is what they call it. And, and I think it reiterates the fact that we need to be standing with the people of Afghanistan. I think that's very important.
Yeah. What are the chances of this legislation being passed in the Congress?
Well, I'm going to be meeting with the speaker here within an hour or so.
To talk about this
Yes, sir.
legislation?
Talk about this legislation. Chuck Schumer, I don't know what's going on with him. I've been very disappointed in our United States Senate. And that's me personally.
How many members of Congress support this legislation? I'm sure you have talked to.
Yeah, everybody I've talked to has been in favor of it, and most of them are wondering why we haven't done this in the past. And this is one of those things, why do we have to pass a law to do it? Well, we have to nudge this body.
How many co-sponsors for the legislation?
Yeah, I don't even know. I couldn't tell you today. I probably could tell you I'll have to research it. I don't know. I don't know. And I don't go out and get co-sponsors a lot of the times on my bills just because a lot of people do that, and that's all the effort they put into it. I want to get it to the committee, because if the committee hears it and I talk to the staff about it, it doesn't matter all those. I just think that's a wasted effort. That's a lot of, and some of this legislation is a lot of show. And when the word gets out, if this legislation's out there, then it organically comes back to me. The folks will call and say, hey, I want to be a sponsor on this.
So you're hopeful that this legislation will pass?
Yes, sir, I am. I'm very hopeful. We're successful with another piece of legislation.
When is going to be introduced for a vote?
Well, I don't know. It's in the committee right now, and I'm waiting on the committee staff. They seem very favorable about it. Mm-hmm. They do what's called a markup. It's not. When I was in the state legislature, I could propose something, and I could be voting on it in committee next week, and the following week I could be on the floor and then be up to the governor's office and be a law. This is a lot different. It's moving a lot of different parts, and hopefully, like I said, organically the support will grow for this, because when people find out that we have not identified the Taliban, and we're duplicating our efforts, and that this is a responsible way to go about legislation.
Mm-hmm. And what will be the impacts or consequences of this legislation on American foreign policy towards the Taliban and also on the Taliban?
Well, first of all, we're currently funding the Taliban partially. Every week we give them money, and that was another piece of legislation that I passed, but it did pass. And I think it's just calls them out of the terrorist organization anytime they're mentioned, the Taliban, which has been identified as America as a terrorist organization. I think that creates a designation, and then that stops any and all transactions between them and the United States of America.
If this legislation is passed in Congress, what will be the consequences for the Taliban and American foreign policy towards them?
I think it'll hit them where it hurts the most in their pocketbook. I think it'll stop any funding from America. It will call them out, and internationally, I think that they will be put in such a spot that it will force them to go further underground, and if not, disband.
The American administration has always said that this money is not going to the Taliban. It goes to the UN agencies. You don't believe that?
No, I don't. I don't trust the UN. They have not had our interest at heart. They take our funding, and they attack our enemies verbally, if not physically, and they continue to me, it's just a mystery why we continue to fund them. Because we fund them, we're one of the largest contributors to them, and then they continue to side with our enemies.
And this legislation, one part is about designating the Taliban as a terrorist group, but another part speaks about the Vienna process, as you described earlier. You know that Vienna process is basically representing the national resistance against the Taliban, headed by Ahmad Massoud, which is a military resistance against the Taliban. Do you think Taliban should be military defeated in Afghanistan? Do you support that idea?
If it defeats them, I would. If it does, I don't know that we need Americans dying doing it, but I would think that we need to support, enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I believe that. I think they are bad actors. They treat women like cattle. They disrespect us internationally, and they cause a lot of harm. And I feel like anything we can do to disrupt them delivering violence throughout the world, I think it's a good thing. So
if it takes U.S. to send money and weapon and other support for anti-Taliban military resistance, you support that?
At some level. I don't know what level. We have a bad habit of being on both sides of every conflict, it seems. We send money to Israel, but then we send money into Gaza, and the money, it's there. When Ukraine and Russia got into it, we funded gas contracts with Russia and then sent money to Ukraine. We sent money to Taiwan and probably borrowed that money from China to defend themselves. So I think, and how it's sold to America is that look at all the money that our defense industry is making, these American jobs are making off of our support in Ukraine. And to me, that just is not our purpose at all. But I think the reason we do this is because the Taliban causes us a lot of problems.
Like what?
Well, terrorist organization. They're all funneling money around, and it's affecting trade. It affects our allies, so therefore it costs us more money. So I would think that would be reason enough.
How concerned the U.S. government is about resurgence of Al-Qaeda under the Taliban umbrella in Afghanistan?
I think there's a confusion in all these groups, and I share in that confusion. I think that we talk about that a lot, and we talk about it in the Foreign Affairs Committee. But until there's a terrorist attack of some sort, we don't pay attention to it. We respond to it, and I think if we could just get a little further ahead of it and dismantle some of these groups, which is what my attempt to do is with this. And I don't know if it'll be effective, but what we're doing right now is not working.
So if it takes for American troops to go back to Afghanistan and dismantle Al-Qaeda or their supporters, which are the Taliban, you would support that?
I don't know that I'd support American troops going back, but if we find that they're disrupting our trade and they are a threat to us, then we would be doing that, I assume.
But you will definitely support military groups resisting the Taliban in Afghanistan.
If we in fact, if we know the facts that they are actively disrupting us, then yeah, I think it's it's a response. But I'm cautious of that.
Yeah.
I don't want another. I don't know that we need to unleash the full military might, but we do this all over the world. But the problem is that we don't follow through with it, and these people are our enemies. We know that, and I think we have to be really careful because of. And that's why America doesn't support these things, because we don't see any production from it. And what our intention to do is to put forces in place that are, one, friendly to us, but two, I would hope that honor their own people and they're not dictators.
During the 80s, United States supported Mujahideen when they were fighting against the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. But that eventually ended in the civil war. Of course, to the defeat of the Russians in Afghanistan, but also the civil war and eventually the Taliban. Some people are concerned of that kind of, consequences eventually from any military support. What do you think?
We've already got them against us. I don't know how we're going to turn them that much more against us. I think, but through this Vienna, hopefully, with this process, that would help eliminate that. And then the other countries would shoulder the burden. It wouldn't just be us. And as far as the, it's pretty clear when we started arming Mujahideen that we did not follow through with that. And that eventually, as you stated, but my guess and my wish would be that these empires would be reduced back to almost a tribal situation where they would not have the capabilities of, and we make it uncomfortable for our enemies and for folks like in China and Russia that arm these folks to not be, to not do that. And hopefully on the world stage, United Nations. But if the United Nations doesn't want to play ball with us, so we ought to just pull out.
In the recent presidential debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, both of them spoke of Afghanistan. Trump was like, he wanted to get the Bagram airfield back. But Kamala Harris also talked about Taliban as a terrorist group. Do you think Afghanistan is becoming a serious issue in the American elections now?
With some folks it is, but I don't think it's, I don't think it moves the needle that much. And it won't until there's a terrorist strike or we see some horrible actors playing out in the Middle East and that we could have prevented.
So the situation of women and human rights in Afghanistan, how much that matters, to the U.S. public and your constituents, for example?
I think it matters a lot. Actually, you hear a lot about it, although it's sort of a pick and choose kind of thing. When it's under one administration, you'll hear more talk about it than under another. And again, we can't be the world's police force on these issues, but we don't have to play ball as in trade or any of these other things. All this, I feel like a lot of this can be handled through trade. It's not necessarily military. It's supporting our friends and developing a trade relationship with them so they can further it, and that we're not. It's not a give and take. It's a give on both sides, or a take on both sides, I guess, economically.
Here in Congress, when you hear the Taliban, pass this vice and virtue law, which forbids women from talking in the public, forbids any kind of living thing shown on screen, on TVs, and things like that. What kind of reaction you see among your colleagues in Congress?
I think we're so covered up with that. We see that so often, more so than the average American does, that maybe we're a little watered down with that. It doesn't have the effect it would if you were just show somebody working folks that don't have time to watch the news every night, that are too busy raising their families. But I think it strikes a chord. It strikes a chord in the Christian community as well as other places. So I think it's a valid point to make that we should not be supporting our enemies that do this kind of thing. And currently we are supporting the Taliban. So
if you're not supporting the Taliban, you're against any kind of support for the Taliban, especially any kind of monetary support.
Yeah, but see what they're trying to do. It's like they're bribing them to be nice to us. And that to me is a empty vessel, because that'll run dry one day and then creates that vacuum for somebody else to come in. I just think it's a bad precedent.
Do you think Congress should engage with other actors in our society in Afghanistan, including the members of civil society, women's rights activists, politicians, media, and others? Is there a will inside the Congress to do that?
Yeah, and I think a coalition type of situation in Afghanistan would be very pleasing to most members of Congress. They could see that as a sure sign of support, that our support is going to something.
Do you think if Harris is elected as the next president of the United States, she would have a different approach compared to what the Biden administration did?
Right. No, I do not. I don't think she has an approach. I think she has.
But she called the Taliban a terrorist group.
She was reading a talking point. I'm sure her polls showed her to do that. I think Trump probably shoots from the hip what he thinks, not what, that's a simple thing to say, a terrorist group, and then move on. But what are you going to do about it? Trump has a clear record of going after terrorists and eliminating them. And this bunch, their record is paying them.
If Trump is elected as the president, what kind of advices you would give him about Afghanistan, on Afghanistan?
I tell him, let's stick with our friends. Let's not play ball with bad people.
And we hear from people like yourself, Congressman Mike Waltz and Chairman McCall and others, kind of the same narrative about the Taliban in Afghanistan. But do you think Donald Trump, as a president, would listen to this kind of advice? I
believe he would. I really do. I believe he would. 100%. Because I know he's talking to those folks right now, at least Mike Waltz. And he and I came to Congress together, and I know he has President Trump's ear.
But it was President Trump again who signed the Doha deal, which is, considered in Afghanistan as the backbone of the reason why the republic failed and Taliban took over.
Yeah, I realize that, but it was also the enforcement of this current administration that I think it really set it on its heel. And Trump did what he said he was going to do. But again, they didn't follow to the T what he said to do on the pullout. And I think that's where a lot of our problems were created.
And if you give 3 pieces of advice to Donald Trump when he is elected on Afghanistan, what do you tell him?
Well, I wouldn't give him advice. I think he'll know. But I would, I'd tell him, let's honor our agreements. That's all I'd say.
Including the Doha agreement?
Well, if they don't, if we find that they're bad actors involved in it, then no. I mean, I feel like we haven't, in an agreement, there is a quid pro quo, and I don't feel like that's been followed by the other side. So I don't know that agreement is even valid.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.